Hey everyone, Amanda Bates here, founder of the Black Expat, and I'm glad you're joining me this week. My next guest is Motsabi Rooper, and Motsabi is a race, identity, and belonging expert who is passionate about supporting parents to build belonging, healthy racial identity, and strong self-esteem in children of mixed and Black heritage living in predominantly white spaces and context. You could say her interest in this work stems from her own childhood experiences as the child of a former Black South African activist and a white British journalist who met during apartheid. Much of our conversation is underscored by the messages she received about race and identity while growing up in Britain after her parents separated. In this episode, we explore those experiences and the lessons on identity she felt were conveyed. We also discuss her early career in diplomacy and human rights and why she chose to leave it behind. And she shares why she also coaches parents to build self-esteem of their mixed-race children, in many ways, giving them the support that she wished she had gotten as a child. Motsabi's personal experiences have guided the work she does today, and I can't wait for you to hear how. Welcome to the Global Chatter. I think that today's discussion is going to be a fun one. We all know, I say this every episode, it's not going to change. I have the coolest guests that come on the show. And so there is no reason to think otherwise about this episode. And so from the intro, you know that I have Motsabi with me today. And how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Amanda. I'm really excited to be here and be in the cool category already.
By the virtue of being here, you're already in the cool category. So
okay.
it can only keep getting better from here. You guys can't see us, but we're definitely laughing about this because, every episode I get excited about the stories that are going to be revealed. And I think that there's so much wonderful depth that we're going to hear in your story. And so this is the first question I ask almost every guest because it's just a fun one. Where in the world are you currently sitting?
So I'm currently sat in my office in London, in South London. Yeah, I've been here for the last couple of weeks because 2 weeks before now, I was in South Africa for about 2 months.
And we were talking off air about weather, which always seems to work its way to conversations with me because it is, at the time of the recording, winter in the northern part of the world. And if you were in South Africa, I would imagine it was not winter.
It was summer. In SA, it's what we call December. So it's like, because that's when they have the school holidays, right, in December.
Yeah.
So it's like a big party. Everyone takes time off and it's very much summer and I'm very much missing it, honestly.
And now you're in London weather, which I imagine is not sunny or warm.
Not at all. So I'm definitely, it's really motivated me to continue working on my plan to at least spend, 4 of the coldest months a year there.
Oh my gosh. And so I think that's a really good jumping point into starting to get a little bit in your background. And so where did you grow up?
So I grew up here in London until I was 7. I grew up in quite a multicultural area called Brixton in South London. And then at the age of 7, I moved to possibly one of the whitest areas you can find, just on the outskirts of London, with my mum when my parents separated. And I was there for about 2 years. Lots of experiences, being the only kind of Black and brown face around, and also in my family. And then moved back to London. And then from the age of, from university really, because here in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but you move away for university. So I went to the north of England to a place called Leeds to do my degree, during which I did a year abroad. And then as soon as I came back, I just started the international careers that I'm still kind of in.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So there's a lot there.
Yeah.
As I'm looking at you and I'm like, ooh, let's kind of unpack that. So you grew up in a multicultural area, at least until the age of 7. And so what is the background of your parents?
So my mum is British and my dad is South African. So they actually met towards the end of apartheid. in South Africa because my mum was a journalist and she was documenting the end of that. My dad was an activist. And yeah, so basically, as things got really bad, because at the time, if you were black and political, you were basically on the run and the government was trying to kill you. To put it simply, it was pretty soon after they met. Basically, he needed to get out of the country because they were killing his cell, essentially, the people that he was political with. So he got a scholarship from the British Council and came to the UK and studied and lived with my mum. And a few years later, I came along. So, yeah.
Interestingly enough, you aren't the first person I've had whose parents were political activists in Africa. I had a couple on who the husband, his father and his mother in Zambia, say, kind of in the 60s, 70s, had to flee.
Yeah.
And they fled to California, and then they couldn't go back for the longest time because they were being, for lack of a better word, hunted, right?
Yeah.
Because they were against the government powers that be. And so that has to be really interesting. I mean, your mom was a journalist, your dad was an activist, kind of growing up in that environment. And I mean, and that makes you kind of a cross-cultural kid, right? Because your dad had his South African background, your mother had her British background. And so obviously, you mentioned your parents separated, but even growing up, did you see yourself as part South African? Did you see that identity at all? Or what did you see?
Yeah, I did. And I think I always had this sense of wanting to learn and bring more of that into my house. Because, I think like what can happen, at least in that generation, to a lot of, here we don't say biracial in the UK, we say mixed families, is you end up within the family centering the culture of the country you're in, or in many cases, the kind of culture that's closest to whiteness. There are a few ways that happened in my family. I think the main one is that my dad didn't speak to me in his mother tongue. Which obviously has a huge impact when you do that, because it meant that it was harder for me when we did go back to South Africa to connect with family, even my grandmother, or I have a half brother and sister there. And I spent quite a few years just unpacking that and thinking about and understanding why that is, because it turns out that's pretty common. And yeah, really, in the case of my dad, it really links back to, in his specific case, trauma. Because actually in South Africa at the time, under apartheid, it was absolutely enforcing this hierarchy, and the black languages were deemed as secondary. So I think even though he understood on a political pain or political level that, I'm fighting against racism, I think some of those more subtle, like psychological legacies continued, and he didn't quite see them, and then they kind of replicated themselves within my upbringing and my life. So I understood that I was South African, but I think there were ways in which I couldn't fully access that part of my heritage until I was much older and able to kind of take that into my hands a lot more, which I continue to do.
So you were able, as a child, at least to go to South Africa and at least connect with the family who was there?
I was, and you know what? I am so grateful for that. I mean, I think I just clung onto that and ran with it as fast as I could. So as soon as, I was able to kind of save up, early 20s and, go there myself and strengthen those relationships, I did. And it was because we went just those 2 times. I went 2 times in my whole childhood, but that was enough to have, a connection with people, to have people's numbers, and to be able to rekindle and really make an effort to grow those relationships as an adult. So yeah, I am so grateful, and yeah, that's something I absolutely bring into my work now as well.
You're not the first person I've actually heard say that, where there is a entire cultural framework outside of the one that they've grown up in, where they're going to go meet extended family, where no, they didn't necessarily, and it really runs the gamut. Maybe, yes, they did go every year or every 2 years, or maybe they went twice or 3 times their whole childhood. And it's amazing to see sort of that, oh, I have this place, right, where this part of me is tethered to, and I understand, especially when, and I think you describing, once your family moved from Brixton, I am sure then going from a very non-multicultural space and always being the other, right?
Yeah.
There's some reprieve in being somewhere where there's like, oh, this part of my identity is affirmed. And so I'm fascinated because, you know, as I said, definitely I would say you are a cross-cultural kid. You have parents of different backgrounds for a variety of reasons. What then was it like growing up as someone who has this South African identity? You've got a white mom. You're no longer in this multicultural space. Like, what was that experience looking back for you?
I think it was shaped by race and racialization for me. So for a long time, and this is from when I was 7 and I was living, you know, with my mum, her, and then after a while, her partner, and the only black brown face in the family that I had contact with. I had a completely different experience just going to school, walking down the road to what they had, right? And there wasn't much space in my house to talk about that. And so I didn't really develop a language to talk about that. And what that meant is that I, for a long time, thought it was in my head. And for a long time also thought I was, you know, there was something wrong with me. Like I was kind of mentally not okay, that I was making it up. And actually, I think some of that probably started before my parents split up, because, you know, what happens is if you're, so we say mixed, if you're walking down the road with one parent, the white parent, you know, it's all kind of smiles, you know, doors are open, very welcoming. And then depending on the levels of anti-blackness in the area, if I then walk down the same road at the same time with my dad, it's a very, very different experience. Now, my parents wouldn't necessarily fully know that, because like, you know, I'm walking down the road with one, I'm walking down the road with the other. Right. And I think as a kid, you know, we are so sensitive when we do pick up on these things. I think it would have started there, and I do remember that. But it was then heightened when my dad wasn't on the scene so much, and that was amplified by not living in a multicultural area. Just the aggression that I was picking up on, I internalized, basically, because there wasn't that language, there wasn't that space to critically reflect and think about it with an adult. And so I did what most kids, you know, would do, which is, you know, you end up, I blamed myself. I thought there was something wrong with me. I thought if I'm picking up on aggression, you know, I don't have that whole history, that whole context to bring to my understanding. I think, oh, there's something I've done. There's something that's wrong with me. So that led to a huge lack of confidence, you know, really low levels of self-esteem and a lot of anxiety, pretty much throughout my childhood, that I have spent a lot of my adulthood undoing, and I'm very proud of, actually. But yeah, I think that was what shaped my experience in particular.
You know, I've asked this question. I had Jerry Jones, who is really cool. Not the owner of the, unless you watch American football, some people would think I'm talking about the football coach. I'm not. This is actually someone else who, he has 2 children. Him and his wife have adopted. One is Asian American identity. The other one is African American identity, right? And him and his wife are white. And so, you know, we spent we actually had to do a 2-part episode talking about what are the things he had to be aware of as a white parent who, quite frankly, had 2 children of color. And the thing is, they were expats. So what was even crazier, not crazy in a bad way, they were expats in China and had an Asian daughter, and they had a black son. Right. And so everybody's experience was something different for all kinds of reasons.
Amazing.
Right. And then George Floyd happened, and the questions and the conversation he had to have with his son. Right. And so I'm curious, because Jerry didn't grow up traveling, didn't grow up in a international space. He didn't travel until he was a young adult as well. With your mom, did you feel and that there wasn't an awareness, or there was an awareness, but not necessarily sure how to address sort of the racial conversations and the racial identity or the situations?
So I think there was maybe the wrong awareness. right?
Okay.
So
Fair.
in her mind, you know, because she was a journalist, before she had me in the 80s, she was doing quite political, you know, documentaries about political topics across the world. So her understanding of racism was very crude. It was apartheid. It was segregation. It was, you know, these really in your face forms where you might
Right.
have a white minority government oppressing in law, right, like a black majority population.
Right.
However, in the UK, still today, the way in which racism plays out is much subtler.
Right.
And I think if that was a framing for both my parents, apartheid, you know, that's their understanding of racism. So they are not, I think they weren't aware enough of the nuanced way in which it plays out here. And so they were aware of the topic, but absolutely not aware of what I was going through. And, you know, a lot of people of colour go through in the UK. And I think actually, I was thinking, you know, the whole experience with Meghan Markle, and I don't know if you saw the documentary she did, was actually really helpful. I think in that documentary, in slightly highlighting the ways in how much you can feel gaslit, experiencing racism in the UK, because everything's so polite and they wouldn't really say, you know, the word that would mean they need to be called out. Still really insidious, and it's still really, really harmful, but it means it's deniable.
Mm-hmm.
So it means that you can, you know, in my case, really think it's in your head. Because if someone's saying all the right things, but still being aggressive and passive aggressive in the way that you say it, you will still pick up on it and you will still 100% feel it. But those around you, if they're not experiencing that directly, won't necessarily pick up on it themselves. So I have empathy and understanding of their context, but I think they were looking the wrong way, not fully looking. And the other thing is, I think they fell into this trap that, you know, if you're in a mixed relationship, it's relatively easy to fall into, that you think, okay, great, had this mixed kid, I've cured racism. Like, we've done it. You know, we've mixed. This kid's come along. And especially when you look at stats, like it's the fastest growing population in the UK. Like, it's so easy and people, you know, I can understand the desire to want to believe this, that it's over, like it's not going to be the majority. And I think they really fell into that. They really, really fell into that. And the other thing I would say, I guess maybe in their defense, is there wasn't really as much research into this as there is now. You know, we had amazing sociologists who were really starting to document and piece it together, but still it takes a few years for that research to come out. So it was looking backwards. And I think a lot of people in the UK at the time, we had like a Labour government and the buzzword was multiculturalism. Everyone wanted to buy into this dream. And I think my parents did too, which is why they didn't pick up on it.
You know, and I think you highlighted something that for all the good or bad you can say about Americans, we are loud and we're very consistent. Yeah. And if there's anything to call out, which is I think why also Megan Markle is probably driving the paparazzi nuts, is that Americans just, good or bad, loud, right or wrong, right? If it comes to calling something out, Americans tend to call stuff out, and especially when it comes to race, especially if you have a Black identity, we are not that polite.
Yeah.
As we know, I mean, if you're not in the US, it's amazing to me how much you can see what's trending in the US when something goes down. You could be as far away, but somebody will know because Black voices here tend to be loud and let it be known, right? And so I think that you have just framed and given actually some really good context, both I think to your life, but I think even contemporarily, because, you know, I'm not going to, people know this, I'm listening to Prince Harry's audiobook
really?
Spare. So.
I'm yet to listen to it. I can't wait.
Oh my gosh. My God. he narrates it, so it's great.
Yeah.
And this is the first audio. This has nothing to do with anything. It's the first audio, but I'm usually, I read the book, but I was like, let me listen to it. It's super long and he narrates. But I think a lot of the stuff that has been in the press and the media of recent has been also referring to the impact of the racism, the comments, whatever that his wife has faced both in and out, both within the royal family and out. And so I think you actually in your own life has just sort of given context for those of us who are not in those communities and in the UK and don't necessarily know them. And so here's where I'm really interested in, even with all this context. And you started early and you talked about, okay, you ended up going to university. I'm assuming the University of Leeds. Is that where you ended up?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. But I know somewhere in your story, you went to, was it Honduras?
Guatemala, okay. Spain, you name it. Yeah.
Was that while you were in university or before or after or when?
Okay. So so that was during university. So before the UK left the EU, we were allowed to do something called Erasmus. Have you heard of it? Okay, so basically it was a fully funded, it was amazing, year abroad that the European Union would pay for, as part of their project of like integration across Europe, this idea that you get to meet other people your age and maybe one day you start a business and then you connect. So I got this fully funded year in Spain. And actually the reason I went to Spain, so I was, as part of my degree, doing some Spanish modules. So I was pretty fluent by then. But I should take it a step back, actually, because before going to university, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but traditionally, you can do what's called a gap year. Mm-hmm. So it's quite a traditional thing here. So you basically you finished high school and you want a bit of a break because you've just gone through exam after exam after exam. And basically you get a year off and you secure your university space before and you defer by a year. So that's all secured. And, most of us spend, I don't know, maybe half the year earning some money to then be able to travel for the second half of the year. And what I did with mine, because I knew I was going to study international development at university, well, I thought, well, I probably need to see what is this? Why are we dividing this world into so-called developed and so-called underdeveloped? Like, let me go and understand what this means. Let me go to a quote unquote underdeveloped country, but also let me go to one that's Spanish speaking because I'm pretty fluent and I'm going to be tested on it in uni. So I went to Honduras, San Pedro Sula, and worked with a bilingual English project in a school there, which was really interesting for many reasons. And just the way that race is kind of understood is again a different context, right? Different words. I almost want to, I don't think we swear on this podcast, do you? But
people swear.
Okay, I kind of want to say it's like the same shit but a different flavor. Like, do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
no,
it's not that anyone's or any particular country's racism you can definitively say is better or worse, right? It's different. It's like a different flavor and it has its own challenges. So there, although I wasn't at the brunt end of it, I could absolutely see its dynamics and its setups there as well. But anyway, back to the question. So I did that for 6 months. Came back, went to uni, did a year in Spain where I got to study some development and economics at a university in Spain. And then that really set me up for what very, very quickly after university became my career, which initially was in diplomacy.
You mentioned, you were going to university for international development. I'm going to touch on the Honduran thing in a minute, but what was your trigger for wanting to do that or study that or look into that?
Yeah. And you know what? I still sometimes ask myself that question. How idealistic was I, right? Like, did I think I was going to be some kind of quote unquote savior? Right? And like the truth to that uncomfortable question is probably quite uncomfortable and I'm picking. What I can say is I always had an interest and an awareness in the world. Being part South African, I was aware that my dad's context in which he grew up in which I had a brother and sister, in which I had a grandmother and a cousin, was totally different and a lot poorer and looked a lot different than my context. And I think there's something about being the only in a lot of situations. I was always on the lookout for like, where are people who look like me? And very quickly realized, okay, a lot of them aren't in this country or on this continent. What are these countries? Like, where are we? Right. So I think some of my interest stemmed from them, and that then led me into, real interest in history and, all those kinds of studies. And studying international development was a way of piecing it all together, because you look at the history, the politics, the economics of, collection of countries, a region of the world. And also you get to do bring in, hopefully, and definitely in the case of when I did my master's, some kind of critical analysis of that as well. So I think it was probably my own story and interest leading me into that awareness, and then wanting to just understand the world.
So, if you're joining us from after the break, we really got to the start of your story, Motsabi, working in international development. And I'm curious now. You talked about how you got into it, and that was actually really interesting what you laid out there. So how did you end up working for the government, and what was your transition into that job?
Yeah. So it was quite random. If I'm honest, I think I look back and I join the dots, and there was definitely this theme of being interested in the world, caring about the world, being aware of inequalities, and I guess idealistically thinking, what can I do to bridge them? But it was luck in terms of how I ended up in my first job, which was working for the EU Foreign Service in Guatemala, in that I attended on one of my last days of university a presentation. Basically, how when you're leaving uni, all these employers come and they say, come work with us. Anyway, this one lady had come to Leeds, to the UK from Brussels on the Eurostar to talk about the EU, basically because not enough Brits knew what it was, and they weren't, we were meant to be represented in that organism, and we were disproportionately not. And she just did a big style really, and she said all the buzzwords like, you get to travel, and we actually have a foreign service, because most people didn't know. We just thought it was like individual countries that have their foreign service. And and I think it helped that she was a woman as well. But the career she described, and she described it as being multicultural, people coming together from different countries. I was like, yes, I want in. So there were a couple of grad programs and paid internships. I applied to one thinking I was going to Brussels to learn French. And it turns out they had what they call a junior professional program in one of their delegations. And because of my Spanish and because of what I'd studied, they sent me to Guatemala, and I had the most amazing, I want to say training ground, but that's quite rude, right? Because this is so for people, living that reality, that's the situation was really, really hard, right? Post-conflict, don't want to go too much down the history, but things were very, very raw. A lot of people died. There were a lot of tensions between the previously warring groups, and there was a lot of healing that's, still to be done. And even though, it ended 97, it still felt very, very fresh. It was a really, really challenging first post that really made me dig deep and really take time to understand the history, take time to understand the dynamics. If you wanted to be able to relate to anyone and really hear anyone and really understand anyone. So yeah, I ended up working there for just under 4 years. I initially thought I was going out for 6 months. So that's how I ended up there basically.
So I'm fascinated because I've talked to diplomats. Almost all of them have been Americans. So I'm very interested as someone who was serving in the British Foreign Service. What typically does the makeup look like, right? So one of the things that the U.S. Foreign Service has been working towards has been diversifying very intentionally since at least the 90s, right? Especially gender, especially individuals of color. What was the British Foreign Service looking like, at least when you joined?
Yeah. So initially, and for most of that posting, I wasn't even in the British Foreign Service. I was in the EU Foreign Service. So it was an even odder room, right? Because there are very few Brits who were in that space. Because so the idea is you had EU member states, the EU countries, the embassies were present, but there was also this EU delegation that was meant to bring everyone together and allow people to lobby as a group and influence as a group. In that space, I was the only non-national person of colour, the only Black person. I identify as Black mixed race. And the impact that had on me, because in a way, no change, right? Like my whole life, I was used to that in my family, in my school, in university, because people of colour are underrepresented in being able to study languages in the UK, because you get to really get to the right level if you go to private school, you know, all of these barriers. But for me, that was same old. But what it meant in that context is I was quite dissociated. So I'm not saying I didn't do a good job, because, you know, you're there to follow a brief, and I absolutely did. But the themes that that brief was touching on, because so much of it was about human rights, should have been deeply personal to me. And I had empathy, but I couldn't relate it back to the personal in the way that truly underneath it all, it really did. Because the parallels are unbelievable between Guatemala and South Africa. So a lot of these stories, a lot of these experiences, it could have been my family, it could have been my dad. And I totally dissociated and shut that off as my coping mechanism. And I think because of that room, and because that's what I think I had to do, because that room echoed my experience in my family, and that's what I had to do in my family to survive, right? I had to block out a lot of the owning up to the levels of racism, too painful. So I think I echoed that there. I did spend some time in the British Foreign Service, and, you know, I think not all member states, but certainly the UK isn't a member state of the EU anymore, but in the British Foreign Service, you know, today somewhat still work alongside colleagues from there in my current job, but they have done a lot to diversify. You are starting to definitely see, and I was at the time, people of colour coming through and representing the UK, and therefore a truer version of the UK, right? But nowhere near as diverse as the US Embassy. And the US Embassy was a real inspiration for me at the time, actually, because there was this amazingly outspoken Black US ambassador at the time. It was under Obama. And he was so outspoken, and the levels of racism he faced in the media, and he did not go silent. It was inspirational. And I just, you know, I couldn't fully relate myself. I couldn't imagine myself doing that and getting to that place, but it was inspirational to me.
It's super funny to hear like someone else say how diverse they see the American Foreign Service and being American, to be like, it's not diverse enough.
It's not enough. It's not enough.
Let me say it's not enough, but it is. It's, man, isn't it crazy though? Like I say, where you sit on the spectrum of things, it's like,
right?
For me, I'm like, oh my gosh, it could be so much more diverse in the way it is. And for someone else, it's like, we're not even there yet. Like the fact that you're there and doing what you're doing. And so that's kind of cool, actually. Sorry, that has nothing to do with your story. It's just my brain going.
No, it's interesting. It's perspective, right? Like, right. It's that bad.
You're right. We're both like, oh my God.
Right. I'm not even touching on the other EU member states. Like if you take Italy, right. You know, I have a lot of, I'm currently working with a lot of Italian mums, and they struggle to even like find resources that even mention Black people in their history. And Black people have been in Italy. Like there were Black Roman emperors. Like right. So right. It really just depends on which way you're looking, but not enough. I would agree.
I'm always amused where there's some places where people are just completely surprised about Black people being in their history. And I'm like, right? It's just because you erase them from your history. It doesn't mean they weren't in your history. Yeah. So that doesn't surprise me, but you're right. And I think if you extrapolate what you were doing with the other EU member states, like, absolutely, I know. And look, here's the thing. Your countries reflect the populations that you have, right? So there's some places I do not expect them to be necessarily racially diverse. It would be nice if they're ethnically or tribally, because they're different cultural groups, right? It'd be nice if they were that. But then there are places like the UK, which you fully expect, honestly, UK, France, Germany, you fully expect that y'all need to get it together because you have you have the populations that are that diverse. And so, I mean, you're not in you're not in the government internet, that in that space anymore. And you said you had gone into this position that took you to Guatemala. And you thought you were going to be there for 6 months, and then you ended up being there for 4 years. Was it that you didn't see yourself doing this type of work for the long haul, or was it that it wasn't even a consideration that it was something that you could do? Like it didn't even occur to you. You just thought it was a short stint. I guess ultimately I'm like, why are you still not in diplomacy?
Okay. So initially it was a 6-month placement. But to do effective work, you need to be there for a lot longer because there's such a important history to get your head around to be able to properly exchange with people. So it made sense that it became 4 years. Now, why am I not still in diplomacy or in government? I know exactly why. And that is because the big change point in my life where I was able to relate what I was doing and bring myself and fully show up as myself, as opposed to saying too dangerous, I just have to conform, was when I did my master's, because I did my master's at a place called SOAS University that is renowned for critical perspectives on mainstream theory. And so I did for my master's international studies, and I finally got to find all of these critical theories, like critical perspectives on international relations that made, having been working in it, complete sense to me. And I was like, this relates so much more to what I've seen and experienced and what's actually going on than what you learn in an undergrad or meant to abide to. Finding those writers, and again, first of all, I had to find them in relation to something detached from myself, right? International relations, before I could then bring it to myself and think about racism and the ways that I'd internalized it. But nonetheless, it was freeing, and it finally helped me fully understand that I was not seeing things in my head when I was a kid. It wasn't something I had to push down. It wasn't something that didn't happen and I was misinterpreting. Like, these power structures and the powerful way they affect us unequally are real. And once I'd found that and written about it, I basically found my voice. And so after doing that, I did briefly go back to government, but I kind of realized I probably need to get out, because I can't stand up in a room and advocate to that extent, when actually I think we're looking at the wrong thing, not really saying the full picture. I just couldn't get in line in the way that I wanted to, and that felt aligned to me. So that began the process, which I'm still in, of leading me towards the work that I'm doing now, which is basically gone from the systemic political, how do we tackle inequality and, all the challenges of the world systemically. I still acknowledge the systemic, but I'm moving increasingly towards the personal, and in my case, the familiar, like in the family, and, really increasingly centering the child, because if you can get it right, my whole theory is if we can get it right before that programming really sets in, there's such an opportunity for kids just to change the world and fly and do well themselves and not have to spend so much energy like I did on, in my case, undoing all that anti-blackness that I'd internalized, or thinking there was something wrong with me. So it was absolutely that master's and finding those philosophers and thought leaders that cut across all social theory.
I mean, I've got to give you credit, because it is somewhat brave to be in something and then realize, I don't think I can hang out with this for the long haul, because and to make the change, because on one hand, I think someone listening to this would be like, well, it wasn't a good fit, or it wasn't going to be a long-term fit, or it didn't fit with your life plan or vision plan. But on the other hand, I mean, let's be honest, there's a prestige to being in
Absolutely.
diplomacy. There's a prestige to being the foreign service. There's a prestige to being able to live internationally, depending on what your role is with a foreign service office unit, right, in a country.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of people who really want to do that and don't have access, right? The people who know about it, who really want to do it, don't have access. So for you to say, I feel like this isn't aligning with my values or where I'm going, is, first of all, is brave to make the pivot. But I think what's even more interesting is that you made a pivot that allowed you to take what you had learned and what you had seen and what you had experienced and put it into a different direction. I know you've made an allusion to this, but you've got your day job, right? Which you have your day job, but there is also some coaching and some teaching, and I am intrigued by this podcast. Is this a podcast?
Yeah.
This podcast name, that I'm like, tell me more about this. Right.
Yeah. So, I guess just on that, because I hear what you're saying, right? There's like absolutely a level of, there are many levels of privilege, and there's a level of privilege in that I was in that space, right? And then I chose to move out. So my mum, like a lot of people in my family, would absolutely be like, you've thrown your career down the drain. What are you doing? But I'm not as brave as you think, Amanda, because the way I feel is I did not have a choice. Like, I was getting ill. And the way I interpreted that was as a misalignment. You know, when you feel like you feel it in your body that something is misaligned, that was what was happening. And I was actually getting ill. And, for me, it was actually just this continuation, I guess is what I'm trying to get across, of like to be in such white spaces that only subscribe to one narrative, which is, anti-Black at its core. And I'm talking about in my family and in the theories that I had to subscribe to. That was my whole childhood, and that was damaging and traumatic. And, to continue that was unhealthy for me. And, there are loads of kind of like contextual factors that amplified that. Like, for example, when I came back to the UK after doing my master's, the government changed. And so, things were, there were lots of comparisons made between Boris Johnson and Trump, for example. So it was getting harder and harder to say to myself, I'm happy to go across the world and like defend these things. And I really, really wasn't. But yeah, just to like be honest about that and say it wasn't just bravery. Like I felt like I didn't have a choice. Basically, for me, it was just that integration of self, like bringing and acknowledging self, and like allowing myself to bring in my lived experience as well as my research, as well as my work experience. And the way that it's come together is in what I'm doing now, basically, which is, so the day job is I work for an international children's charity on kind of education programs for children that bring in child protection and health and all the things in underserved communities at the moment, particularly in West Africa. But what I'm increasingly doing as well is moving into this coaching space. And this is what I'm so passionate about, which is really working with families that look like minded, to coach parents through how they can show up for kids of colour when they're the only one. So this could be, parents parents who have gone through transracial adoption. So that's why their kid, might be the only Black person in that family, or mixed families. I think in the US it's biracial, because the themes, and I'm just so grateful that this research is really, really coming through now. There are so many parallels. And I know that there are so many different ways for a family to be mixed, but the parallels and themes, like the commonalities of, the belonging question and the belonging issue that the kid goes through, and how easy it is for hierarchy to creep in between, okay, the whiteness needs to be centered and the brownness is a second class, and the ways in which that damages children's self-esteem, mental health, ability to learn. Who knew? I certainly didn't, that it wasn't just me. Like, this is a thing, and the research is really showing that. So I think because I went through that and I've had to have empathy for my own family, I'm able to bring that empathy to mums. And I understand that there's so much political work to be done on, changing this at a political level, and I'm here for it. But where I'm most passionate about is really working at that familial level and bringing that empathy and understanding and working with, what the situation currently is and where people find themselves in that journey, so that parents can essentially move their own feelings, work through them faster so that they can show up for the kid on their identity journey.
Do you find that a lot of the mothers particularly, or I mean, it could be parents actually in general, you're working with are non-Black?
That's what I'm focusing on at the moment.
So that's so I was picking on that because I never said the name. What's the name?
White mums. You know what? I'm working on the episode, so I haven't fully launched it, but I want to call my podcast. But I do need to test it with
right.
Because maybe it will be off-putting. But Dear White Mama Bear.
Yeah, fair enough.
And I guess, for me, it's coming from a place of empathy and a place of love, because we need them to be in that space to be able to do the work. I think if it's in a space of shaming and if it's in a space of calling out, there's absolutely time and place to call out. But my goal is to get them to improve immediately, right?
And I
learn fast. Yeah.
And I was gonna say there can be it's a fine line, right? I feel like especially for Black folks who want to share information that could be particularly helpful to particularly parents raising Black children, right? And biracial children with a Black identity. And I think you get on some side nervousness because there are questions, even, where I'm coming with this is that even with the Black expat, I have families who are completely not Black who follow us because they're raising Black children abroad, which is a whole other level of whatever, right? And I think there can be nervousness about asking questions to things in the sphere because you're like, oh God, I don't look like this child. I'm asking the group of which this child comes from, and I don't want to come across as offensive and be sensitive. So there's that little bit of fear. And then, I think on the other side, once again, I'm also American. So I don't think there's so much more concern on the Black side about calling stuff out. I think it's more, but I think to your point, I think you're trying to be in a way where it's receptive and so that the change can happen. And I know folks who are like, oh, this change is going to happen whether you it or not. We're not always as delicate. Some people, but here's the thing. I think that if anyone is ever coming from a place of, I really want to get this information to be transformational for my child and my family, if you are of the group that child identifies or comes from with, people are receptive to helping you because you are saying, I need help, right? Yeah. And so I think that the work that you are doing and the work that you're looking to do will be received because you are coming from a genuine place of, first of all, this is your lived experience. Yeah. You have a white mother, you know the impact both between your own personal experience and working in other spaces, what it looks like. I want to help you. I think that those who are in the place to receive and hear it will receive and hear it. That being said, there will always be that contingent that, as you know, will feel like, well, why are we always got to talk about, well, we heard this in the States. Why do we always have to talk about race? Why is it always about race? Like, we're all just one, we're all one big happy family, which clearly we are not. So.
Yeah. So many things in that. So I guess on the, one of the critiques that is can be made of what I'm doing, I've thought it through a lot, is that it's not radical enough, right? Like, people just need to get in line and get with the picture. And we've wasted many decades spelling things out. It's time to just get in line and just know these things. And what I always think of, the analogy I always think of is one that I used when I was in diplomacy. And that's like, if you take civil society, you can go from the very conservative organizations to the more radical. As a whole, if you take it as a whole, the people who are more radical push everyone forwards, right? The people at the edges, right? So when you come together, it's very effective. And I'm clear that what I'm doing to some people who are in that space, you know, and are saying, I don't have time, you know, like, just get with it. I'm not going to break this down for any more people. I respect and I get. That's not what I'm doing, however, and I'm consciously not doing that. The way I have chosen to work is child-centered. So the reality is that child is in that family now, and unintentional harm is harmful, and it can still be unintentional. So that's what I'm working with. I'm working with the unintentional harm that, you know, parents, of course, do in so many different kinds of ways. And I find the most effective way of doing that is kind of circumventing that nervousness and, you know, inviting it and acknowledging it, and acknowledging the journey that, you know, in this case, white mums do go on. So a lot of them I work with, you know, of course they knew racism existed, and of course they understood it somewhat on an academic level, on a theoretical level. But the truth is, once you have a baby and, you know, people start to say certain things to you and assume certain things about your child, it's shocking. You might have known it intellectually beforehand, but it's absolutely devastating and shocking. And you go through kind of what I could compare to a form of like grief, like the stages of grief, right? And what I do when I work with people is try and support them to get through that faster, so that we can really focus on, let's create an approach so that you can really show up for your child, because your child's going to go on this identity journey, and, you know, it's in the water, anti-blackness, so it's going to be absorbed. So what can we do? What can we put in place to rebalance that, counteract that, prepare them for bias, so that, you know, they can still have, even though the world is as it is. I'm not saying that other people don't go off and change the world, but I'm saying with the world as it is, so they can still we can still safeguard their self-esteem, their sense of belonging, and help them create and have a positive racial identity, because it is possible even in the context in which we live. And for a lot of mums, you know, it's like this guilt around living in a predominantly white area. Okay, they may feel that they can't, you know, change that. That might be the right decision for the family for whatever reason, but whatever the context is, we can work with, and there are things we can put in place to allow you to show up more for your child. And, you know, the impact of that is just huge. Like, as I say, it's, you know, that when it chips away at that resilience, chips away at that self-esteem, you know, you're getting into mental health, you're getting into ability to learn, because, you know, if the kid feels, and this was me at one point as well, so worried about getting things wrong, because you know, you can't, there isn't space to, how are you really going to take the risk to learn things? And then in the teenage years, you know, you're getting into kind of, you need that self-esteem and self-respect to be able to keep yourself safe and say no to things. So I guess the reason I decided to take this approach is, for me, it's about impact and it's about the child, and that's the way I think I can have the most impact for that child. And I totally respect the more radical approaches that are pushing for a better world. And my hope is that through doing this work with the families and countering that inner anti-blackness from the beginning, that will also give the child more space to then do the, you know, and let's change the world stuff as well. So that's why I've taken the decision to approach it this way.
Well, here's the thing. You definitely have your work cut out for you, because the problem's not going and the issue's not going away. And so, you know, it's going to be interesting to sort of see how your journey goes and how the different iterations of your work goes over the years, as you build upon what you've seen and build upon what you've learned and build upon, honestly, who you come and interact with as well. I think that also shapes with the clients that we have. And so here's always the last question I always have to ask folks, especially those of you who are listening and are curious about the guest's work. Where can you be found? Like, where are you in the interwebs?
Yeah, so best place to find me on social media is Instagram. And I didn't
see that coming. I was like, oh, okay, cool.
I know I'm not the most technical. I know that. Do you know what? It's where I've been able to find the community, find the mums, you know, we're all really coming together. And so I do these little videos, with tips and, you know, people ask me questions, and I suggest approaches. So really building that up. So that's, I can share my Instagram handle. It's my name, Motsabi Rooper. I've got a website where you can learn more about the coaching itself if you're interested, and also the program I've developed. So it's a kind of mix of coaching, mentoring, and some kind of educational modules, and that's motsabirooper.com. And then the podcast, at the moment, the name's still standing. Dear White Mama Bear, should be out in the next month or so.
Well, we'll have it all in the show notes, and it'll be up on the Black Expat website. So if they're trying to reach out to you, you can be found there. This has been interesting. I have enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for coming and sharing a bit of your story. It's always interesting to hear people's upbringings and to see how it impacts the work that they do moving forward. And so I've appreciated having you.
Thank you, Amanda. It's been brilliant. And like, you know, as I said to you before we started recording, I just was so inspired to come on because this is what I needed. And I started my international, you know, work. So thank you for doing this. It's needed. It's absolutely needed. And it's like a real privilege to be here. So thank you for your time.
You've just listened to an episode of The Global Chatter, which is hosted by me, Amanda Bates. It is edited by Stephanie Ficcio. Don't forget to subscribe to The Global Chatter on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at The Global Chatter, or stop by Twitter and find us at Global Chat Pod. If you have a question, want to subscribe to the newsletter, or are interested in sponsoring, visit theglobalchatter.com.